Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to a new lecture provided to you by Travolution. My name is, of course, Dr. Lilian Céspedes González, and I am bringing you today a brand new lecture that is sponsored, as usual, by our amazing members, supporters, and sponsors through PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. If you want to become part of our lovely, lovely community that allows us to keep on sharing knowledge, information about travel, history, culture, and the whole world. The details are, of course, in the actual description, and you can find us on paypal.me/Travolution Tours or buy me a coffee at Travolution. In any case, today I have perhaps a little bit of a heavy topic to discuss. And as usual, this is not at random. The reason why I decided to bring this lecture forward to you all is because I am confident everybody listening to this would know the state of the world currently. We have many, many wars going on at present, and the destruction of cities, human life, and overall, the way that we currently live is constantly on the news and on our minds. So I decided that perhaps we needed to understand how we've gotten here. I think talking about things like the First or Second World War or more modern day conflicts can sometimes be a bit detrimental for us to try and sympathize or empathize with the problems that we're currently enduring, not because they are not obviously relevant, but because, remember, there are still many people that actually had to live with these issues and that have feel the war directly in their flesh. So I sort of feel that in order to engage with the subject in a way that is safer, sometimes maybe it's easier to look at further distant past, to put a little bit of ground between us and the current events, and actually understand how, whether it's in the past or now, some of these things actually haven't necessarily changed over time. And the way that things changed in the past, it's what's actually informing our present and will keep on informing our future. So, on that note, I'm obviously going to be talking about war today, the impact of artillery in early modern civilization, particularly from the perspective of Europe, which is the history that I know. And I appreciate this could be a sensitive topic. I'm not particularly going to be giving any gruesome details. So, it's not like it's going to be awful, nitty gritty, disgusting, in that sense. But of course, there are certain things I cannot tiptoe around. So if you simply don't want to hear more about the destruction of humanity, I completely understand. This is the reason why normally I specialize in culture, but I feel, and it has been the voice as well of many of our members, that this kind of information needs to be out there for as many people as possible to, think about the circumstances. So just like with the Battle of Tannenberg, I'm turning today to this subject to help us, uh, digest, process, and take action into the modern day world problems. And on that note, let's get started, shall we? Well, first things first, what are we going to be talking about today? This is a relatively straightforward structure. We need to understand first how the origins of artillery, of gun warfare begin in Europe in the Middle Ages and how they come to Europe, of course. Then we will be talking about the military revolution, which is a concept we always find involved in the development of the early stages of artillery in early modern Europe. Then we will be talking about how the artillery keeps on spreading around and the impact that this is going to have in the defenses and fortresses, because of course we had to actually protect ourselves. And finally, perhaps the most important aspect of this lecture is the social impact. War is awful, and often we don't think about it enough from the perspective of how it impacts humans. It's not just the loss of human life and infrastructure, it's the psychological impact, it's the fear that it installs in people's minds. And this is something that we can really trace all the way back in history. And of course, the general concerns around, these issues and a brief reading list for the period appropriate that we are looking at today. So, without any further ado, let me get started into, the Middle Ages and the period we're mostly going to be looking at. So overall, and as a brief disclaimer, when I mean early modern Europe. We're really going to be talking mostly about the period between the 1500s and the 1700s, which is considered one of the most warlike in terms of years of war, the frequency of the war, and the magnitude of these bellicose conflicts. There are going to be a lot of changes in war at that moment in time that are going to be impacting the experience of war, but particularly are going to change the way urban enclaves and communities also experience not just war but day-to-day life. But in order to understand that, first we need to take a step back to the Middle Ages. We need to see how we were at before. So what is the background of medieval warfare? Well, the majority of medieval warfare, whether it's from the early Middle Ages all the way down to the later period, is mostly based in manpower. And the majority of the armies, consisted of footmen, archers, and a few machineries, particularly as we move later into the Middle Ages, things like catapults, trebuchets, etc. And as we're getting closer to the 14th century, we start seeing the appearance of early mortars. Okay? Well, armies were not terribly big normally, with a few exceptions. And overall, warfare was damaging and devastating, but within reason, within a degree of control. Now, the changes are going to really come by the 14th century when this happens. So, early gunpowder changes how we destroy each other, I guess. It had already existed since ancient times in China, although, the application originally was to do cool things like fireworks and entertainment. As time goes on is when we start finding that this black powder can actually set things on fire and create big explosions. So then it starts being applied to modern artillery as a way of, evolving warfare. And that is how it starts seeping into European societies through the trade with China. And from the point of view of our medieval European perspective, in the way we know it, it was invented in inverted commas by German engineers and properly used for the first time by the Venetians in one of their many wars against the Genoese, normally naval battles that require, cannon warfare. And this is how we end up having the appearance of this kind of cannons, which is probably what most people would recognize as an actual cannon and not the previous slide, into the majority of most armies across European nations. So from the developments that we see in the 14th century and over to the 15th century, the appearance of artillery starts becoming standardized, and this is what takes us over to the period that we call or refer to as the military revolution. Well, the military revolution is a series of changes in tactics and strategies that really impact the scale in warfare. It's believed to have originated in the first instance in the Netherlands, but its apogee, the moment where it's most significant, culminates during the reign of Gustavus Adolphus in Sweden, which is the gentleman that you see here on the left. At this moment in time, Sweden is going to be one of the superpowers in Europe. So the period that we're looking at essentially is the first third of the 17th century. We've moved the clock forward a little bit. And the main changes concern not just the use of artillery, but the way fortifications are going to be replying, of course, to this new power of destruction to protect communities. But this is not the only aspect of warfare that changes. Because the nature of war increases in size and in frequency, people feel the need of trying to source other means to keep their armies going. And we start seeing the rise and the increasing use of what I guess we can call military brokers to actually procure for some of these armies. And just so you understand, in the same way perhaps some of you may use a broker to acquire, your house or car insurance, this was a little bit the same. You essentially paid a guy to raise mercenary armies for whichever government or reign you were representing, and essentially the contract required them to provide certain numbers, certain specifics. You gave them a fee, and in exchange you had this third-party administrator of your now running army. And this ended up having great severe impact on communities. Of course, the vast majority of armies up until this moment in time used mercenaries, here and there. It was not necessarily the core of their armies, and most armies were not standing armies. They were people that were conscripted into levies and raised as of when it was required, with few numbers of lingering military men in important enclaves. Well, as we are having now this kind of trained professionals, this starts to cause a problem with certain communities. Some of these people will go and use their force to take anything that they wanted, and it will cause social unrest, particularly in the countryside, in terms of supplies, ammunition, etc. Well, this also means that we need new recruitment methods to get larger armies and more bodies, right? Because at the end of the day, well, cannons can cut clean through anything. And that is the moment in time when we see most armies in Europe making use of, particularly problematic members of society, problematic from the point of view of the military aspect, both from a social and a community perspective. This is the moment when we start seeing the exploitation and use of criminals to go into war, regardless of what crime they may have committed, whether they stole a loaf of bread or actually killed somebody. That was not necessarily important. The important matter was that they were, wasting state resources in prison. Troublemakers of all kinds. So even if you were not necessarily a criminal, but you were persona non grata, you would quite likely eventually find your way to an army. And at scrapping, the bottom low of any kind of conscription, this is also the moment in time when military powers in Europe decide that apparently it is okay to send people with mental and physical illnesses over to battle. Making use of the most disabled and disadvantaged members of our societies. So armies start becoming something quite different than what we had previously in Europe, and this is going to cause all kinds of social disparities and unrest across the countries. Well, now that you understand a bit more about this, let me also just, show you how this actually changes. The military revolution is not just going to be guys with a couple of swords and lances. As you see, almost everyone in here is carrying a pike and some kind of handgun or cannon. There is lots of smoke. There is a lot more death because simply the nature of warfare has become a lot more destructive. And this really starts having an impact in the human psyche, which is something I really need you to take into consideration because it's going to play a big role as this presentation develops. Well, so artillery incoming. How do these machines change and why and how do we use them? Well, there are going to be many different changes, but one of the most important things that happen to these kind of machines is that, previously, as you had seen, cannons were essentially just this one massive barrel, which you kind of had to lug around one way or another. So we start developing carriage devices to make them easier to display and transport. But the main critical change was ammunition. We stopped using stones and we start using cast iron shots, which are much more accurately calibrated and they are completely able to flatten masonry, which means the power of destruction towards urban spaces or fortified areas is more devastating. And it also means now we require a different kind of resource to apply to war, more metal. Well, the examples that you have here on the screen give you different ideas of the most common type of cannons that the majority, not all, but majority of armies across Europe would have made use of. On the left, you have an example of a Russian pistol, which is essentially a small caliber cannon that was mostly used in fortress defense. As you can see, you could put this in different openings and it was mostly as a way of repelling an incoming attack. They are small, they are mobile, they actually were supposed to help, the people protecting any fortress to have at least something at hand that would give them a tiny bit of an advantage. And then on the right, you have the representation of what normally we call the Cannon Royal. This is the masterpiece of most armies, and it actually had a bore of 8 inches and 8,000 pounds in weight, firing a shot weighing 63 pounds at, much higher speed and, of course, much higher impact than any previous stone cast could have done. So these are huge security threats. They're essentially destruction on wheels, and people sincerely get scared of them. But it's not just the cannons. We start seeing a lot more handguns. This is the moment that a lot of people associate with pike and shot, armies that, as you can see, are not heavily armored in terms of what they are carrying in comparison to, for example, the knights of the later Middle Ages. Because frankly, if you're clad in metal of any kind, it doesn't matter. If someone has a handgun, it's probably gonna go through you regardless. So as you see, the way in which warfare starts affecting different aspects of society, of military organization, through the increased use of artillery, presents some complications and some considerations that will shape the way we do things. And as a result, well, we decide that we need to defend ourselves better. This is just your typical medieval fortress. The majority of medieval fortresses, and even examples that we have from Roman times, tend to have a relatively linear masonry work that is fairly flat. Towers tend to be round because they're a bit easier to design with the technology of the time. And, well, they are not very well protected for the incoming artillery. So what is the issue? What is the result? Well, most communities, first of all, decide that they need to thicken their walls because, again, consider that it's not the same having a wall that you've created to mostly protect yourself from guys coming at you with sticks and shields or horses, in which in theory any thickness, as long as it's well done, would create a problem because the main issue is that this is an obstacle that the army needs to, go over or around rather than through. So they decide to just reinforce taller walls or thicker walls to get rid of the problem to begin with. And another very common way of improving these fortresses is the addition of gun loops in the lower areas of the wall to protect the most vulnerable points, particularly entrances and gates. These gun loops were relatively easy to do as well because most fortresses would have had little openings for arrow slits, and often all you needed to do was just widen the arrow slit to have enough width and the right shape to let a bullet through. So in many ways, these were quick fixes, if you see what I mean, that could bring them up to speed. So it was easy to modify some of these medieval fortresses to make them through. But this wasn't always useful because that still meant that many of these fortifications had many, many weaknesses that the enemy was going to use against them. And this becomes quite well known after a massive incident in the area of La Rochelle, where we start seeing the development of what you have now in the screen, which is the diamond-shaped bastion. This kind of bastion essentially allowed the defender to hit back the enemy from different viewpoints, making it less vulnerable to surprise attacks and making it better protected from artillery fire by not having a completely round or flat surface. A cannonball would have to keep on hitting the same place just to get through. It's just a matter of engineering, architecture, and physics, if you see what I mean. Well, the problem is, for the vast majority of fortresses, adding one of these things was sort of not necessarily easy, and often these bastions were seen as cumbersome. And this is what takes us to the developments that happen in La Rochelle. So you have here one of the maps that we have from the area of La Rochelle. There was actually a massive Huguenot massacre in Vassy. So the Protestant French forces decided that they needed to do more than the basic upgrades that those medieval fortresses had been suffering. And the long process is what we see here in La Rochelle, which is frankly an insane amount of modifications to the existing fortress, but actually very, very successful. They add an extreme amount of angled bastions in different parts of their original fortress. Then they add an extra layer of little defense points to provide further support for the inner city. And that is how they were able to survive with the new implementations, the nasty siege that occurs in La Rochelle in 1572 to 73. So as you can see, people learned from what had happened in other places and understood very clearly what could happen to your community if you just didn't have the right resources at hand. It wasn't necessarily easy or cost effective to always do this, and sometimes there is such a thing as overkill, but you would do whatever you needed to do to keep your people safe. We will see what kind of problems this would lead to in a few moments, but let me take you to the next step of fortification upgrade. This is the impact that this has in La Rochelle, and the argues between the diamond-shaped bastion or other bastions and ramparts is kind of going to be back and forth in different parts of Europe until the 17th century, when Sébastien Vauban, the French military engineer, will change the way we actually see fortresses and the way they become popular. He is actually considered one of the greatest military engineers in history. And this man was working, of course, for the Sun King Louis XIV. The best work that he creates is in the area of Lille, and he becomes very popular for these star-shaped fortifications, which is what you see on the screen now. They are almost, impossible to overcome this kind of fortress, because you have an inner pentagon from which different angled or diamond-shaped bastions protrude into, leaving you with many different vantage points, with different trenches that you can dig and use to separate layers of the fortress between, putting ground essentially between you and the enemy, and forcing them to waste more and more ammunition and more time to bring down the layers of fortification. As you see, the majority of the buildings are not terribly tall. They try to keep in line with the height of the fortress, because at the end of the day, well, everything was potentially in a delicate balance, if you see what I mean. Now, what's the other wonderful thing about these fortresses from the point of view of engineering and architecture? They're actually quite elegant and simple yet efficient. So while many of the other designs come across to many patrons as ugly, cumbersome, and not terribly very good value for money, this is the opposite. It's almost like saying, well, if you're not doing this, you're first of all not as fashionable as the Sun King himself, and second of all, obviously, really behind the game. So although Vauban popularizes them, and by the way, many star fortresses from Vauban in the area of France are UNESCO patrimony because of the preservation and the impact, of course, that they have from a historical perspective to the development of human societies. But it's not just going to be exclusive to France, by the way. This is going to be developing everywhere else. And in fact, a very common example of this type of fortress that we have in the area of Spain, nearby the French border, is in the city of Jaca. La Citadela de Jaca, the Citadel of Jaca, is one of these also very good examples, as we have many others, like, for example, in Luxembourg and further across into the territory of Germany and Italy. So this means that human societies have been able now to defend themselves so well against cannons that actually artillery kind of becomes useless against these star-shaped fortresses. It really pushes combat to stalemates, and that meant that the only option that attackers had to really, overcome this was to use some visibility issues that the very shape of the fortress, since it's a bit more spread out, could generate. But of course, there were very easy ways around it. And it could be anything from simply adding a couple of gun towers on one of the bastions so that you would have a 360 view, or creating fully water covered ditches. Most ditches in the Middle Ages were not actually full of water, they were just a big trench because, well, you could throw cavalry at it, it wasn't going to go any farther. But in order to get past some of these problems, the attackers would use mining tunnels. They will mine a few miles away from the fortress and then try to sort of carry the tunnel through so that it would collapse the fortress itself, or they could get their men into the fortress in an area that would then cause trouble. But of course, if you add a trench with water, that means that the mining galleries aren't going to go absolutely anywhere. And on top of that, it will also prevent a lot of these places from escalating walls, since now the height of the walls have also been modified depending on what the fortification is designed as. So this is how we reach this stalemate and how sieges essentially, well, mm, will become problematic for people, but for other reasons. So, as usual, in the history of mankind, particularly in the history of warfare, we don't know what was worse, if the malady or the remedy in many ways, because this is going to cause actually a lot of problems, particularly for urban societies. And I must put emphasis on the fact that this mostly applies to urban societies, to communities, cities, fortified enclaves, etc. As time goes on, since sieges kind of reach a stalemate in terms of war, the majority of the bad things that happen during the siege don't even have anything to do with the war itself, but actually with other stuff. And this is how urban spaces start suffering side effects, which perhaps were not first expected, or they may have been expected, but only if you had some insight and some, hindsight in that regards. So one of the first things that we realize, though, by having all of these fortified communities across Europe, is that there is some positive psychological perspectives. There are going to be also some negative ones. From a psychological perspective, a lot of people, a lot of communities felt stronger because they were behind fortifications, so a higher degree of security. There was also often a higher degree of independence from the crown or their overlords, since they sort of were providing for themselves, if you see what I mean. And there was a higher sense of community because at the end of the day, you were all behind the same walls. You were in this together. So it creates also distinctions between people living inside of the walls or in the enclosures outside of the walls. And this is how the outskirts of cities are going to become sometimes problematic neighborhoods, and how there is going to be a bit of a class war between people living in towns and fortified enclaves. So, as you see, some things are for good, some things are for bad. There is also an enhanced relationship with the local countryside because, of course, as an enclosed settlement, you, to some extent, expected the possibility of an attack. So you needed to have better communications with those people around you to ensure abundance of supplies so that you wouldn't be caught in a, sticky situation. But this is also going to push for changes in edification. So from what you can see in the engraving in here, a lot of the buildings are going to start going up and up and up and up and up. If you walk around anywhere in Europe, you will notice that from the 16th century onwards, houses just keep on having more and more and more stories. They tend to be thin and tall. Why? Because, well, also being enclosed by a city wall means that you cannot really expand so easily. The more buildings you have outside of the enclave, the more at risk that they are. So, not necessarily the easiest thing for expansion, and this is going to lead to some other problems. Of course, that means that the streets are narrow, buildings are much closer to each other, and this is not necessarily a good thing from the point of view of epidemics. High risk of infection since everybody is living in much closer quarters. Fire spreads 3 times faster, of course, and sanitation and smells were a serious problem. So, some things improve, some others perhaps not so much. And this is how we reach a stalemate. The stalemate is indeed so bad that artillery was very dangerous for society, but not really from the point of view that you would have thought. Um, if you had the appropriate amount of defenses, the main issue was how do you endure the siege? Because the cannons eventually will stop doing anything to you. So, how well prepared are you to survive famine, disease, and crime? The longer societies spend, behind closed walls, with a war outside, without being able to go anywhere, well, for those of us that may have recently lived something like the COVID pandemic, I think we can understand how that could lead to, problems. And this is how we get to this um, famine, crime, disease, and fire. Fire is a very, very, very serious issue. And this is the perfect example that we find, perhaps that's the most textbook example that we find in European history, which is the Fire of London from 1666. As you can see in the map, all the area that is burnt is roughly coinciding with the main fortification of the city that ran all the way from the Tower of London over to the other side of St. Paul's Cathedral. Even if you are walking around London today, and admittedly much of the city wall is not left, you can get an idea of the size and the impact that this had in the city, because a lot of these streets nowadays are part of the actual city of London, the financial district, and well, the amount of properties, businesses, etc., that were affected by this fire are actually considerable for London at the time. In fact, not far away from St. Paul's Cathedral, we have a monument called Monument in honor of the fire of London that really takes account of all of these issues that were caused by having a very tightly run enclave behind city walls. As soon as a fire goes off, you're doomed. As you can see, in comparison, after the wall, the area that gets really afflicted, it's minimal. And since you have the river on the other bank, of course, it doesn't really get across. And you're probably wondering, well, what's the deal with fire? Well, remember how do we create artillery and gunpowder? There's a spark. And although the spark may not be in the iron is still hot. There may still be residue of powder. In general, if you are having things flying across buildings and the buildings are ordinary houses, businesses, etc., people needed fires to survive. They didn't have central heating like we do in many countries nowadays. The heat and the comfort had to come from somewhere. So fire was enemy number one of these sieges and these fortified enclaves. And more importantly, artifacts like bombards, which had an arson fire, were very dangerous because an ordinary cannon pretty much fires on a straight line. A bombard was designed to actually create like an elliptic range, go over the city wall and destroy everything behind that. And behind that is not military equipment, it's your home. So as you can see, the problem that we have by creating city walls that I guess offer better resistance against war but shape cities in a slightly different way becomes one of these sort of catch-22 situations that we cannot really break from. And this is how things start getting really, really difficult. Now, I'm going to give you some numbers now so you understand the impact of these other issues during this time period. And for that, I need to give you some figures of deaths and war casualties. So if you don't want to be upset by these things, I'm just giving you a heads up. So this is information that I got from research done by John Landers. And John Landers is studying the period between 1620, 1719, so right towards the tail end of what we would call the early modern period. Well, this gentleman calculated that the death causes in Sweden, looking at it from the perspective of the military revolution through Gustavus Adolphus and the great power that Sweden was at this moment in time. At this moment in time in Sweden, the vast majority of people that died in there, despite the constant amount of warfare, even during battles, that actually they died of disease. 80% of the people involved in these battles of any kind died of disease, while only 12% of them died in actual combat. So, what was the point of upgrading all of those armies, if you see what I mean? To just end up on square one. In military warfare during the Middle Ages, the siege is king because people are terrified of losing their lives in the battlefield because life is precious. And the Middle Ages already had many other problems. Sure, life and sanitary conditions and medicine have improved a little bit better by this moment in time in Europe, but it's not like we are, experiencing the great renaissance of modern medicine. So our options were still limited and people were definitely not bulletproof or famine-proof, more importantly. So, as we see, the history of warfare goes back in full circle in many, many other periods throughout time, whether you're looking at evidence from the Roman army, from the great Chinese armies all the way up to the Song dynasty, whether it is, the armies of Genghis and Timur, even warfare in certain parts of Africa, particularly in the jungle, or even the Aztecs and the Incas, it's not often the war that kills the majority of their people is the secondary effect of the war in the shape of famine and disease that ends up taking the biggest toll. And that is how, well, we start having this concern about the development of this technology, which keeps on happening faster and faster and faster as time goes on. Now, there is going to be, of course, a reaction to all of this, which is the fact that, well, people are going to feel that the city walls are in fact constricting them. This is going to be creating a lot of tension, and that's also going to be leading to a lack of expansion. And of course, humans need to find other ways to survive. So by the later 17th century, many city walls all across Europe start being destroyed either by the war or actually by their own cities who decide we're not going to keep on maintaining this. We need to, improve. We need to get more land, get bigger. So we start preferring open plan towns, similar to what we have nowadays. Most European societies, and even all across the world, it's very, very, very few towns really in comparison to the amount of cities that we have in the world nowadays that you will find that have a fully fortified enclosure or even remnants of a city wall. They're almost like, gold dust because we get rid of them one way or another. So that entirely happens because we realize that, maybe we have reinvented the wheel a bit too much and we need to change. And that is also what's going to force another change in warfare, which will become much more, I guess, impactful in the development of the second half of the 18th century and definitely the 19th century. We stop fighting so much for cities, for sieges, for specific locations, unless they are of very high strategic importance. And the majority of the war starts being moving towards frontiers, towards passages, towards other strategic locations that control logistics, supply lines, etc., etc. And that is, again, how our own, I guess, way of experiencing war is going to push us to take these conflicts away from cities directly, although still affecting cities and citizens of the whole world one way or another. There are some, of course, exceptions to the rule in this case. In England, because of the nature of the English Civil War and in general the nature of warfare in England throughout the Middle Ages, many, many towns were often not walled until the later stages of the English Civil War in the late 17th century. And the response is very different, for example, from north to south. I mean, you can't really compare how the impact of the war was in Yorkshire than, for example, Hampshire, if you see what I mean. We also know that in Eastern Europe, the development of these fortifications also happens a little bit later, so the timeline is not exactly linear for everybody. And we know that even all the way up to the later part of the period, places like Germany and Russia preferred reinforcing walls rather than creating these brand new designs, simply because they didn't necessarily think it was the greatest or the best way forward for their people overall. And what I really wanted to ask once again is, what about the psychological impact? I don't know if any of you listening to this today have ever heard a gun, and I mean an actual gun, fire. If you've, even if it's just a handgun, the bodily response, the impact that it has in your psyche is remarkable. Firearms came to stay because they were effective, but also because of their violence. And I'm not just talking of their physical violence, I'm talking of their literally psychological warfare. Hearing those things 24/7 outside of your home made you scared. It made you live life on the edge. It made you feel insecure, and it made you truly think that at a time where perhaps Europe was finally moving forward into a different direction after endured the Black Death and the great famines of the change over from the 15th to the 16th century, it was almost like there was always something to be looking out for. And now that you have that image in your head, think about that. Think about all of those places now in the world ridden by violence, by gun violence. And don't think necessarily just of the bullets and the people who end up being killed by them. Think about every single person who every single day of their lives go to sleep with the thought, with the feeling, with the tension, with the PTSD, with the trauma of knowing what gunfire sounds like. and the response that that sends to your body every time that you hear that, or an alarm in reaction to that. Gunpowder and artillery is perhaps not greatest at changing European mentality about warfare, because as you see, we just went back in circle, but it changes the way that warfare is definitely leveraged to impact the human psyche and to create terror. And that is something very real in our world nowadays. So, as much as I don't often like ending things in such a somber note, I definitely feel that today is one of those days. So I hope that you can forgive me for that. But before I leave you, I would very much like to introduce you to some further reading. So, if you wanted to learn more about this specific topic, here are 4 books that are relatively easy access and that I think, without much distress, would give you extra knowledge on the subject. Wolf, Walled Towns and the Shaping of France is very important, particularly to see how we go from places like Carcassonne or La Rochelle, who were ordinary medieval towns, to the development of the bastions, and then of course the fortifications of Vauban, because in France it is actually something that you can see very clearly, the transition from one side to another, and how that is also gonna help shape France and their military developments as now one of the new power players in Europe. Because up until this moment in time, well, the French had their wins and their victories, but they really take the lead at this moment in time. Geoffrey Parker, anything that has to do with Geoffrey Parker and the early modern world in Europe is normally gold. His study on the military revolution is actually very straightforward. It will help clarify a lot of the technical aspects, and it's pretty linear. It's not super heavy either. I think is one of the great benefits of Geoffrey Parker. He writes in a way that is, thorough and perfectly academic, but without necessarily being super overwhelming. Then the illustrated history of the impact of artillery by Kinnard, I think it's useful because sometimes you need to see the images to understand the subject, and it's the typical thing when one image is worth more than 1,000 words. In the case of artillery, the visual aspect of it all is important, and when you are also engaging with it from the safety of you making this decision and truly engaging with it because you want to, I think you will truly discover some fascinating elements of technology and engineering, but also the true impact and the devastation, but also the interesting sociological side effects that it had. And finally, Duffy, the Siege Warfare, the Fortress in the Early Modern World, is another very good look as to how these fortifications through and through evolve as time goes on, to the point where they were so bulletproof, quite literally, that they can't really be taken any further than that. And on that note, that's pretty much all for today, everybody. So thank you so much for allowing us to bring this knowledge to you. I do apologize if, again, it's not necessarily your favorite cup of tea, or if it's a bit of a heavy, conversation. But like I said, the main reason why our sponsors, why our supporters, and the members of our community like bringing awareness to these subjects is because in this day and age there is a lot of misinformation. There is a lot of apathy in general towards the world we live in and the circumstances of others. And here in Travolution, whether it's traveling with us or learning with us, we want you to be aware and have a worldwide view, at least as wide as possible, of these issues and how these issues are hardly ever something that happened yesterday. So it's not necessarily the war that started a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. It's human problems that we've been dealing for the longest time, and as time has gone on, we've just amplified through our rapid development of technology and through our lack of learning from our own mistakes. So, on that note, I thank you very much for all of your support, and if you are around for a much lighter session, we'll see you in the next one. Thank you incredibly much for spending some time with us, and see you soon. Bye bye.